The wind came down from the bluffs with a dry hiss, combing dust across Main Street until it collected in the seams of the boardwalk like old secrets. Late autumn had bleached the grass to a brittle yellow, and the cottonwoods along the creek lifted bare fingers at a sky the color of tin. Willow Creek felt smaller in this season, not because of distance, but because people drew themselves in, doors tighter, words shorter, eyes cautious, as if every glance could be a draft. The bell over the general store door clanked once, then went still, as if even metal didn't wish to be heard. Horses stamped and snorted, breath like ghosts. Somewhere a hammer rang from the blacksmith's, the sound thin and cold and lonely as it skipped across the alleyways and died. Clara Merrin liked to think the wind had a memory for kindness and for cruelty both, and that it didn't much care which it carried. She watched the grit skitter along the ridge path as she descended toward town, her basket tucked tight in the crook of her elbow, her scarf knotted close under her chin. The basket was light, 8 eggs cushioned with straw, and 1 imperfect apple from the tree that leaned over her back fence. The path curled from her hilltop house, a pale clapboard square, with a porch that had settled to one side like a tired shoulder. She'd painted the shutters blue in spring, a stubborn patch of sky for herself, and the color had held even as the summer sun had baked everything else to dust. She knew who would look and who would look away before she set foot on the street. Mrs. Haskett from the milliner's would tilt her hat to shield her eyes as if sun were the problem. Old Man Cutter would squint like a man testing a saddle and find it wanting, then spit by his heel. The boys who trailed between school and mischief would try not to smirk and fail at both. None of it surprised her. That was almost its own comfort. You could map an ocean if the waves never changed. She crossed in front of the hotel, the boards complaining beneath her boots, the toes polished only because she wiped them every night, so dust wouldn't be the last thing she saw before sleep. The general store's big panes showed her back to herself for a heartbeat. A slim woman wrapped against the cold, a neat braid looped and pinned, cheekbones sharper these days. 33 and carved down to her proper shape by sorrow and weather. She set her hand against the door and the bell clanked, and every head inside turned a fraction and then pretended it hadn't. She did not apologize for existing. She set her basket on the counter and slid it forward. "Morning," she said. "I've eggs. Good ones. I can trade for coffee and salt." The clerk, young Daniels with hair that refused to obey any direction, looked to his right, as if there might be a second clerk hidden there to consult. He cleared his throat. "Mrs. Merrin, we're tight on coffee. Salt, too. I don't think we can do trade today." "You did trade last week for Mrs. Alders," she said. No anger. She tried to keep anger folded and put away like her Sunday dress. Daniels' eyes flicked to the ledger. That was different. How? It was different. There was a rustle from the dry goods aisle. Mrs. Haskett adjusted a bolt of cloth already straight. "You can't expect folks to forget what was done," she murmured, not looking at Clara. "What was done?" Clara repeated, not because she hadn't heard the words before, but because they were like touching a scar and finding it new. "My husband died trying to pull the Miller boy from a burning ladder. He died with smoke in his lungs, and his hands blistered bloody. He did not light that fire." Mrs. Haskett's mouth tightened. "The barns don't burn themselves." "Sometimes they do," young Daniels said, too bright, too quick, as if he'd thought the thought and regretted it as soon as it arrived. He swallowed. "I mean, sparks, wind. It was a bad summer." "It was the Merrin summer," someone else said, and a few small laughs cracked like twigs underfoot. Clara straightened the strap of her basket. "Coffee and salt," she said again, quiet as a prayer that wasn't meant to convince God so much as anchor the person who spoke it. Daniels pushed the eggs back a measured inch. "I'm sorry. Truly. We can sell to you, Mrs. Merrin, not trade." Her fingers tightened on the wicker handle until the weave imprinted half-moons in her skin. She counted 6 breaths and let each go. It was almost a game now, this tug-of-war between humiliation and the part of her that refused it. "No need to be sorry," she said. "You're only following the town." She lifted the basket, and the fragile ovals nestled within, and stepped away from the counter, without looking at the faces she knew would arrange themselves into victory and relief. On the boardwalk, a pair of boys leaned against a barrel, their talk dropping to a whisper the moment she stepped near. Children could be cruel without malice, which made it worse. "That's the fire, widow," one said, and the other made a sound as if spitting seeds. Then they both tried to look at the sky, at their boots, at anything that wasn't her. She stopped beside them, and because someone had to teach them what kindness looked like even if it was the last thing she did, she said, "Good morning. Cold day." They nodded, and one shivered, and she was not a fool. A mother could send a child to the street to be cruel if it meant that child's belly stayed full. She tilted the basket. "Would your ma like eggs? Tell her I can spare 2. The boy stared at the straw and shells as if they were yellow coins. "We can't take your cursed eggs," he said, but it came out like a question. Then he pulled his gaze away so hard she could almost hear it tear. She walked on, past the post office where the windows shone, and offered her that thin reflection again. The sheriff's office door was open enough to show a slice of desk and the brim of a hat hanging on the wall. Sheriff Alden Cross was not inside, or if he was, he had decided not to belong to the world just then. She wondered whether he ever thought of the night he had stood on the courthouse steps, his voice made big by grief and the echo of anger, and said a thing that could not be unsaid. People had always liked him for his certainty. They liked him better when he gave them a place to set their blame down. She climbed the hill back to her house with the egg basket still full, and her legs stinging with cold and something more invisible. Her house greeted her like a faithful dog, lopsided and earnest. Inside smelled of soap and wood, smoke, and onions. She set the eggs in their crate, set the kettle to boil, and leaned her palms to the table as if bracing against a wave only she could see. The quiet was not her enemy. It was a mirror. It showed her who she had become since the day smoke had stained the sky, and the town learned how easily a story could be shaped if everyone agreed to push their hands the same way. She washed her hands because it gave them something to do, dried them, and stepped out to the yard to see what the garden could pretend to offer in this lean season. Kale bed like a low green prayer, a stub of rosemary. The apple tree's last gift tucked in her pocket had come from a branch that bent like an arm tired of holding itself up. She pinched dead leaves from the porch, geraniums no one but her would ever notice, and set a saucer of water where a stray cat had trained her to place it. These small acts were a fence against the world's teeth. In the afternoon she walked to the creek with her pail. The cottonwoods along the bank held their last coins of gold high, and shook them loose, one by one, in a wind that sounded like a congregation changing its mind. She could not come to the water and not think of Eli. She could not think of Eli and not feel 2 thoughts at once, one tender as breath, one sharp as flint. He had been the kind of man who said good morning to the weather as if it might answer. He'd loved his horses more honestly than most men loved their wives, because horses cannot be lied to, and he had always preferred the honest difficulty. He kissed her brow every time he passed behind her, and once told her that her voice was the color of honey. The night of the fire he had gone because someone had to, and because he was built that way. The ladder had groaned, and the boy had been so light, and Eli had shoved him up toward hands waiting in smoke. The roof came down like a verdict. They had found him with his fingers curled as if still gripping the rung. There were so many rungs in town that had broken since, none of them made of wood. The kettle sang when she returned, thin and urgent. She poured water over coffee grounds she'd been saving by half spoons, and closed her eyes as the smell opened the room. She would make it last. She always did. Sunday came by on the wind's calendar whether a body wanted it or not. She dressed in her brown dress, the hem neatly mended where the porch nail had bit it last week, and walked down to the little white church that had once felt like a home built around a bell. She took her seat on the back pew. The pew knew her by now, the curve of her spine, the way she tucked her gloves into her pocket so her hands would be empty to hold a hymnal if anyone remembered to pass her one. No one did. The hymn rose without her voice and still reached the rafters. The preacher spoke of patience and trial, and of the refiner's fire, and 2 rows in front a woman coughed behind a handkerchief, and a child fidgeted, and a man's boot tapped the cadence of a different day. When the benediction came, the congregation spilled into sunlight and arranged itself into little knots of conversation that parted just enough for her to slide through like water through stone. A few faces turned, a few mouths softened and then firmed again, as if forgiveness were a sweetness they couldn't quite allow themselves without permission from someone who would never grant it. She did not linger. The bell gave its last note, and silence pooled again in the space it left. She climbed her hill slower this time, as if each step remembered all the steps that had come before, and wondered if there would ever be a different kind. In the kitchen, the light had shifted to the long honey gold of late afternoon, and it made the table look like a thing worth attending to. She set her basket down and reached for the tin where she kept the few letters that had traveled safely through grief. She had read them all enough to know their rhythms the way a seamstress knows the shape of her own hand, but one she had not opened since the day after the fire. Because even a light letter can be heavy, depending on what you carried while you held it. She untied the frayed white string and slid out Eli's hand, his careful slope of pen, his impulse to underline where the world might otherwise hurry past what mattered. The page crackled like old leaves. The date at the top was 2 months before the fire, back when the barn roofs were still whole and people still nodded to one another without flinching. Clara, it began, and she could hear him say it, her name slowed by affection. I have been thinking on what a man leaves behind besides the work of his hands. A saddle will wear out and a fence will lean, but a kindness will outlast a man if he puts it in the right place. I do not say this because I think I am leaving. I intend to live till I am gray as a fence post. But in case I don't, I want you to know I believe in the kind thing more than the strong thing. The strong thing is only strong until a stronger thing comes along. Kindness does not get weaker when it is met with anger. It just stands there and waits, and sooner or later a person gets tired of hitting what doesn't hit back. If it comes to it, I hope you will choose that. I hope you will be kinder than is reasonable. It will outlast death if anything does. She pressed the letter flat on the table as if the words might rise like bread with warmth. A sound lifted in her chest and made a small home behind her ribs. Not a sob, not quite, but the shape of one. The day had thinned to blue around the edges of the windows. Outside, a lone cow lowed somewhere on the far side of the creek and was answered. Life continuing. Inane, stubborn, beautiful. She set the letter back in its tin and did not tie the string. Some doors should stay easy to open. The fire had stolen so much language from this town that the few words that remained she would not let be kept from her by knots. She moved through her rooms lighting lamps one by one, the flame taking quick then steady, until the house was drawn out from shadow like a memory you decide to keep. The stove ticked as it cooled. She washed a plate that did not need washing. Evening pressed its face to the windows and fogged them over with breath that would soon be frost. When the first flakes came, they arrived like a rumor. She caught one on the back of her hand and watched it lose its edges. Then another. Then a veil of white that gentled the hard lines of the world, folding fence posts into humps, tucking the scars on the lane beneath a clean sheet. She stood with her knuckles against the cold pane, looking down at the town that had learned her shape in the same way it had learned a stubborn stain on a table, something to set plates around. The church steeple cleaved the gray, and the windows of the hotel showed rectangles of gold, and the general store sat quiet, the bell still. Somewhere a door slammed. Somewhere laughter rose and ended, but she couldn't hear what joke had made it. She thought of Eli's letter, of the word outlast with its quiet defiance. Snow fattened the air until the hill and the street and the church and the creek wore the same color, and the differences between them could be found only by the parts she carried in memory. Her palm left a print on the glass. Her breath turned to fog and then to water. "Maybe kindness is all I have left," she whispered, and because the pain could not answer, the silence did. A simple acceptance, as soft as the flakes settling into the seams of the town. The cold did not come all at once. It crept down the hills in layers like a secret passed from tree to tree, until even the creek beneath Clara's house forgot how to move. Frost filmed the windows so thick that morning light entered only as a dim suggestion. Each day began with the same sound, the hollow crack of ice breaking inside the water bucket when she struck it with the ladle handle. Each day ended with the low moan of wind along the eaves, an animal too tired to sleep. The chickens stopped laying. The last of the kale turned black at the edges. Clara counted her jars, her potatoes, her faith, and found all of them shrinking. At first, she thought she might last the winter quietly, the way she had done every hard season since Eli died. But the hunger in Willow Creek did not belong only to her. It had begun to gnaw at everyone, even the proud ones. The sawmill slowed when the river froze. The freight wagons stopped coming through, and the merchants locked their storerooms with chains. The church pantry emptied before Christmas, and people learned again what desperation smelled like. It smelled of smoke and salt and secrets. One afternoon, she walked to town with her empty pail and half a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. The air was so cold her breath looked solid, like a thread she could reach out and twist around her fingers. In front of the general store, a man argued with the clerk about flour. The shelves behind the counter were mostly bare. The man slammed his fist on the counter and stormed out, nearly colliding with her. "Don't bother," he muttered. "They've got plenty, but it's for the ones who can pay." She did not answer. She just kept walking, because standing still in front of anger was like standing too close to a fire that could burn without flame. Outside the saloon, two men were talking about the weather the way people do when they really mean fear. "If it don't break soon," one said, "there'll be dead stock and dead men both." The other nodded, looked at Clara, and lowered his voice. "There's the fire widow." Maybe she cursed us again. They both laughed, but it was a nervous kind of sound, the kind that needed cruelty to stay warm. By the time she reached home, the sun was already dipping. The sky looked bruised. She put the bread on the table and sat down, fingers stiff from the cold, and listened. From far off came the thin cries of a child. She frowned, stood, and went to the window. Across the narrow road, near the fence where the snow piled highest, she saw two figures crouched beside her trash barrel, small, shivering shapes. The Miller children. Their father had once been one of Eli's loudest accusers. She remembered the night of the fire, the way he'd pointed his finger through smoke and shouted that Eli had lit the spark that ruined them all. Now his children were digging through ashes of their own. Clara opened the door, the wind clawing in before she could speak. "Boys," she called softly. They froze, like rabbits caught between flight and shame. The younger one still held a scrap of onion peel. "You'll freeze out here," she said. "Come in, at least to warm yourselves." The older boy shook his head. "Pa said we shouldn't talk to you." His voice trembled more from cold than fear. "He said your house brings bad luck." "Your father's wrong," she said gently. "Bad luck doesn't care who it visits. It comes to everyone sooner or later." She stepped aside and gestured to the doorway. "Please, I've soup. Thin, but it's warm." They hesitated, whispered to each other, then turned and ran. Their feet beat soft marks in the snow like unfinished apologies. She stood there until they vanished into the dusk. When she went back inside, she closed the door slowly, not to keep the cold out, but to hold her heart in. That night she lay awake listening to the rafters creak. Sleep would not come. The image of the boys stayed behind her eyes. She thought of how people could starve together and still not find mercy. She thought of Eli's letter about kindness outlasting death and wondered whether that was still true when kindness cost more than anyone could afford. Her gaze wandered to the mantel. On it stood the wooden box that held the last piece of her old life. She rose, lit the lamp, and opened it. Inside lay a folded handkerchief, and, wrapped within, the gold band Eli had placed on her finger 10 years ago beneath the summer sky. The engraving inside had faded with wear, but she could still trace the words with her thumb, "Always in kindness." She remembered his face that day, the way his eyes had crinkled when he laughed. He'd been strong and certain, a man who believed that goodness was something you built the way you built a fence, post by post, until it stood on its own. Her throat tightened. She had promised him she would keep that belief. She had promised him she would not let the world make her small. But promises don't fill stomachs. She sat at the table until the lamp burned low, the ring glinting like a coin she didn't want to spend. Then she wrapped it again and tied the knot tight. In the morning she would go to the jeweler. The next day dawned gray and mean. The road to town was empty except for a single crow perched on a fence post, its feathers puffed like smoke. The sky hung heavy with snow that hadn't yet decided to fall. Clara walked fast, her breath marking the air in short bursts. In her pocket, the ring pressed against her thigh like a heartbeat. The jeweler's wagon was parked beside the livery. The man was new to Willow Creek, a traveler who came through every few months with trinkets and tools that looked too fine for this rough place. His sign read, J. Holland, Gold, Silver, Honest Trades. When she pushed back the flap, he looked up from his ledger, spectacles slipping down his nose. "Morning, ma'am. What can I do for you?" She took out the handkerchief and laid it on the counter. "I need to sell a ring." He unwrapped it carefully, turning it in the light. "Good gold, simple work, sentimental, I expect." It was my wedding ring. He glanced up, eyes softening. "My condolences. Lost your husband recently?" "Years ago," she said. "But losing isn't always finished when it starts." He nodded as if he understood. "Prices aren't what they used to be, I'm afraid. Times like these, no one's buying jewelry. Still, I can offer you $15. She had no idea what a fair price might be. It didn't matter. "That will do." He hesitated, as though giving her a chance to change her mind. When she didn't, he opened his cash box and counted the notes slowly, sliding them across the counter. "If you ever wish it back," he said, "I'll hold it for a month before melting it down." She folded the money into her pocket and left without looking back. The world outside seemed sharper now, the cold more personal. At the grocer's, she bought flour, beans, dried peas, and a sack of potatoes. Her hands shook as she handed over the bills. When the clerk gave her change, he did not sneer or hesitate. He only looked tired. Perhaps hunger had softened him too. The walk home felt lighter than it should have, the weight of the food strange against her arms. At the crossroads, she paused, snow beginning to drift down in lazy spirals. The town lay behind her, gray and silent. Ahead, the hill waited, her house at its crest. She stopped halfway up, looked down again, and felt something stir, a thought, fragile as the flakes landing on her sleeves. By the time she reached her door, it had grown into a plan. She worked until dark, baking loaves of bread, boiling beans, and cutting potatoes into stew. The smell filled the small house, warm and rich, and she laughed once under her breath at the absurdity of it. She hadn't cooked this much since Eli was alive. The laughter died quickly, but it left a spark behind. When the food was done, she packed it into pots and baskets, wrapped herself in her heavy coat, and carried everything down the hill. The snow was falling harder now, muffling her footsteps. She stopped in front of the church. Its doors were locked, but the front steps were clean, swept by the wind. She set the baskets there, laid out the loaves and bowls in a neat line, and lit the 2 lanterns she'd brought. Their light made small gold circles in the snow. From her pocket, she pulled a scrap of paper and a pencil. She wrote in careful letters, "All are welcome. No names, no debts." She pinned the note to a post and stepped back. The wind caught her hair and flung it across her face. She brushed it aside, her breath clouding the air. For a long time she stood there, waiting though she didn't know for what. Maybe footsteps, maybe laughter, maybe forgiveness. Nothing came but the snow. Hours passed. The food steamed in the lantern light. A dog padded out of an alley, sniffed and vanished again. The town was quiet, except for the creak of signs and the distant groan of ice breaking on the creek. She began to think she had been foolish to hope. Then she heard the scrape of boots. From the shadows near the blacksmith shop, a tall figure emerged, broad-shouldered, coat dusted with snow, face drawn by the same hunger she had seen everywhere. Thomas Callan. She knew him by his walk before she could see his eyes. He stopped a few feet away, glancing at the food, then at her. His voice was rough. "You're feeding people." "I'm feeding whoever's hungry." He hesitated, then stepped closer. "They'll talk." "They already do." He looked at her for a long moment, then picked up a bowl. His hands were trembling, not from fear, but from cold and need. "Thank you," he said quietly. The word was heavier than any coin. She nodded. "Eat before it cools." He sat on the steps and did just that. Steam rose from the bowl and mixed with his breath. When he was done, he stood, brushed snow from his coat, and met her eyes. "If you do this again tomorrow," he said, "I'll bring wood, the kind that burns slow." Then he left, disappearing into the dark. She stayed there until the candles and the lanterns guttered out. The snow had buried the footprints, but she could still feel the path they made. One man's walk toward kindness. When she finally climbed back to her house, the first pale light of dawn was rising behind the hills. She set her empty baskets by the door, unwrapped her scarf, and looked once more toward town. In the distance, faint but steady, smoke curled from the blacksmith's chimney. The sight warmed her more than the fire waiting inside. The ring was gone, but the promise it carried was not. Morning broke slow and pale, the kind of light that couldn't decide whether it wanted to bless or condemn. Willow Creek lay under a thin blanket of snow, rooftops softened, fences rounded, and the church bell silent, as if afraid to disturb the cold. Clara Merrin stood on the hill above the town, shawl drawn tight, watching smoke rise from the blacksmith's forge in a narrow gray ribbon. It was the only sign of life. Her baskets were empty now, stacked by the door, smelling faintly of bread and hope. She hadn't expected anything to come of the meal she'd left outside the church. She had only wanted to keep her promise, to herself, to Eli, to the word kindness. But something had changed in her sleep. She could feel it before she opened her eyes, a strange calm where loneliness used to live. Maybe it was only exhaustion, or maybe kindness, once started, made its own weather. She stoked the stove, brewed weak coffee, and stepped outside with her cup. The sky was a dull pewter bowl, and the wind had lost its teeth. Down in the town square, she thought she saw a shape move near the chapel steps. Someone sweeping, or gathering, or maybe just looking. She carried her baskets down again, this time filled with new loaves, steaming from the oven, their crusts cracked open like small miracles. The path was slick, but she didn't rush. Every footstep made a sound like folded paper. The closer she got, the clearer the scene became. The bowls she'd left were gone. A few wooden spoons rested against the wall, cleaned and stacked. Her sign still fluttered there. All are welcome, no names, no debts. But someone had added a small drawing of a heart beneath it. Clumsy but sincere, a voice came from behind her. "I wasn't sure you'd come back." She turned. Thomas Callan stood a few paces away, his coat open, hair damp with melted snow. His hands were blackened from work, his breath making clouds in the air. "You said you'd bring wood," she said. He lifted a bundle from his shoulder and dropped it beside the steps. "I keep my word, especially to those who keep the town from starving." "I didn't expect thanks." "I didn't come to thank you," he smiled just slightly. "I came because it felt wrong not to." They set to work in silence. He stacked the wood near the church wall, and she arranged the food. Within an hour, the scent of baking and firewood mingled, carrying through the streets like a memory of warmth. People noticed. Curtains twitched. Doors cracked open. Children peered from behind their mothers' skirts. The first to approach was Mrs. Alders, her shawl frayed at the edges, her face drawn. Her husband had been laid up for weeks with a cough that wouldn't quit. She hesitated a long time at the end of the street, then crossed herself and walked forward. "Is it true you're feeding anyone?" Clara nodded. "Anyone." Mrs. Alders' hands trembled as she reached for a loaf. "Even me?" "Especially you." Tears welled in the woman's eyes, but she blinked them away and clutched the bread as if it might vanish. "God bless you, Mrs. Merrin," she whispered and hurried off. That was how it began. By midday, more people came. A miner with soot on his collar, 2 seamstresses from the hotel laundry, a boy Clara didn't know, carrying a tin pail and a shy grin. No one spoke much at first, afraid kindness might break if handled too loudly, but the sound of spoons and soft murmurs filled the air. Someone laughed, quick, nervous, and it felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Thomas kept the fire going, his shoulders moving rhythmically, sparks dancing around him. When Clara brought him a bowl, he shook his head. "For others first." "There's enough for you, too," she said. He looked at her, something unspoken passing between them. "Then I'll eat," he said finally. They shared a bench by the steps, eating in silence. Steam curled up from their bowls, mingling with the cold breath of winter. Across the square, a few men stood watching, skeptical, arms crossed. But they didn't shout. Not yet. The day held its breath. By evening, the pots were empty. Clara washed them in the snow, her fingers numb, her heart strangely alive. The people who had come didn't linger, but neither did they hurry away. Some even smiled at her as they passed. When she gathered her things to leave, she found a small bundle wrapped in cloth beside the steps. Inside were 3 apples and a note written in a child's hand. "Thank you for the bread." That night she cried for the first time in years, quietly, without shame. Not from sadness, but because something long, frozen inside her had begun to thaw. The next day she did it again, and the day after that. Each morning she rose before dawn, baked, boiled, carried, and waited. More people came each time. They brought wood, vegetables, and sometimes nothing but their company. The sign remained the same, though the edges grew tattered. The townsfolk began calling it the widow's table. One afternoon, while she was ladling soup for the Miller children, the same 2 who had once fled from her, Sheriff Alden Cross approached. The crowd parted a little, their chatter dimming. He was a tall man with a lined face and eyes that carried too many winters. He removed his hat as he came near. "Mrs. Merrin." "Sheriff," she replied evenly, though her hands shook on the ladle. He looked at the food, then at her. "You're feeding a lot of mouths. They were hungry. You're using your own supplies." "For now. Others have begun to bring what they can." He shifted his weight. "The council's been talking. Some folks don't like the idea of free meals. They say it breeds dependence." She raised her eyes. "You mean mercy breeds weakness?" His mouth twitched. "I didn't say that, but you thought it." He exhaled, his breath white in the air. "Eli was a good man," he said quietly. "I should have said that years ago." The words startled her. For a moment, she forgot the people watching. "You accused him," she said. "I did," he admitted. "And I was wrong. We never proved he started that fire. We just needed someone to blame. I see that now." Her throat closed. For years she had dreamed of hearing those words. But standing here, they brought no triumph, only a deep, aching relief. "Then say it to the town," she whispered. He nodded slowly. "I will." And he kept his promise. The next Sunday, when the congregation gathered, the sheriff stepped up before the pulpit and cleared his throat. "We owe a debt," he said, "to a woman we wronged. Clara Merrin's husband died saving others, not condemning them. He deserves our respect, and so does she." The church went silent. People glanced at each other, at Clara sitting alone in the back pew. Then, one by one, they turned toward her. No one spoke, but something shifted. A door that had been nailed shut for years began to open. After the service, Mrs. Haskett approached her outside, the same woman who once refused to meet her eyes at the store. "Mrs. Merrin," she began awkwardly, "if you need sugar or flour, I've got some to spare." Clara's smile trembled. "Thank you," she said softly, "but come tomorrow instead. I'll have stew." From that day forward, the widow's table became the heart of Willow Creek. Every evening, lanterns glowed along the chapel steps. Laughter returned, slow but steady, like spring under ice. Children helped carry bowls, men hauled wood, women baked together. The sound of spoons clinking became a song the town didn't know it had been missing. And always, Thomas was there. He came before anyone else, his coat dusted with ash, his hands rough but gentle, when he handed her new firewood or repaired a broken bench. He never asked for anything, but she began to look for him without meaning to. When she laughed, she caught his eyes watching her, and the warmth in them made her chest ache in a way that wasn't pain. One night, as the stars burned low and the crowd drifted away, she found him still by the fire, stirring embers. "You should rest," she said. "I could say the same." She smiled faintly. You've worked enough for 10 men. I've been working to feel useful, he said. And I do, but not because of the work. Her heart stumbled. Then, because of what? He looked at her for a long time before answering. Because of you. The fire popped, sending a trail of sparks upward. She turned away, not trusting her voice. Don't say that. You don't owe me anything. I know, he said. That's why I said it. For a while, they sat in silence, the snow around them glowing orange from the dying fire. Somewhere down the street, a door slammed, a dog barked, and life went on. But for them, time seemed to still. He reached out, not to touch her, but to warm his hands near hers, close enough that she could feel the heat. "Good night, Thomas," she whispered. "Good night, Clara." He walked away, his shadow stretching long across the snow. She watched until he disappeared into the dark, then turned back to the embers. They glowed like the memory of a sun that refused to die. Days passed into weeks, and the widow's table endured. The townspeople brought sacks of flour, jars of preserves, even quilts to cover the benches. The preacher blessed it openly, calling it proof that faith could be baked into bread and served with a ladle. For the first time since the fire, Clara's name was spoken in kindness. Yet beneath the thawing hearts and laughter, the world was changing again. The river had swollen from melting ice, creeping higher along its banks. The ground stayed wet longer each morning. The sky hung low, pregnant with storm. Clara noticed it, but said nothing. After all, spring meant renewal, and she had only just learned to hope again. When she climbed the hill each night, she carried with her the sound of voices that no longer hated, footsteps that no longer hurried past her door. She would open Eli's letters sometimes, tracing the line about kindness standing and waiting, and she would think, "It waited long enough. Now it walks." Outside, the wind would sigh against the shutters, and she would smile into the quiet. The widow's table had begun as one woman's act of defiance. Now, it was the heartbeat of Willow Creek, and though she didn't know it yet, the real test of that kindness, the one that would bind her fate to Thomas and the town forever, was already gathering in the dark clouds rolling down from the mountains. The rains came without warning. At first, it was only a soft tapping on the window panes, a gentle whisper against the glass that seemed almost friendly after so many dry, bitter months. But by evening, the wind had found its anger, and the sky split open like something torn too wide to mend. The storm rolled down from the mountains in gray sheets, thunder crawling through the valley like a wounded beast. Willow Creek trembled beneath it. Roof shingles lifted and clattered. Chimneys groaned. Water ran wild through the gutters until the streets looked like thin rivers trying to remember their old paths. From her window, Clara watched the rain pour over the church roof and vanish behind the chapel steps where the widow's table had stood every day for months. The fire pit Thomas built was dark now, drowned under a swirl of mud and ash. She felt the weight of it. Her table, her hope, the laughter it had brought, all being swallowed by the storm. She pulled her shawl tighter and moved to the door, listening to the wind hammer against it. Thomas had promised to stop by before the worst of the rain came, to check on the fence near the riverbank. That had been hours ago. The clock on the wall ticked too loudly, marking each empty minute. When a knock finally came, she nearly jumped. She opened the door to find him standing there, drenched to the bone, water streaming from his hat brim and coat. His breath smoked in the cold air. "The levee's near breaking," he said, voice rough from shouting against the storm. "The river's rising faster than I've ever seen." "How bad?" "Bad enough that if it keeps on, half the town's lower side will be under by morning. Your house sits close to the creek, Clara. You need to come up to the ridge." She glanced toward the barn where her few chickens huddled. "I can't leave them. They won't last through the night if the water comes." He stepped closer, shaking his head. "You can buy new hens. You can't buy another life." Her voice stayed steady. "They're all I have left of the life I lost." For a moment he looked like he wanted to argue. Then he sighed. "Then I'll help you move them to the loft. But after that, you're leaving this hill. Understand?" She nodded. Together they crossed the yard, rain slicing through the dark like knives. Mud sucked at their boots. The barn door rattled under the wind's assault, and when he forced it open, the chickens scattered in panic. Lightning cracked overhead, turning everything white for a heartbeat. The air smelled of wet hay and iron. "Quick," he said, catching one hen and handing it to her. They worked in silence, lifting cages to the loft, stacking feed where it might stay dry. The noise outside grew louder, a steady roar of rushing water. When the last bird was safe, Thomas climbed down the ladder and looked toward the open door. The path beyond had become a stream. "We need to go!" he shouted over the wind. But before she could answer, another sound cut through the storm. A sharp crack, like a tree snapping. The ground shuddered beneath them. A moment later came the hollow crash of water breaking free. "The levee," Thomas muttered. "It's gone." Clara ran to the door. Down the hill, she saw it. A black wave surging through the valley, carrying branches, barrels, and half a fence. It moved fast, devouring everything in its way. "God help us," she whispered. He grabbed her arm. "We have to get to higher ground. Now." They plunged into the storm, half running, half fighting against the current that already lapped at their ankles. The cold was vicious. Rain stung her eyes, and the wind stole her breath. Every few steps she stumbled, and each time Thomas caught her, pulling her upright, his grip firm and wordless. Behind them the barn groaned, its walls bowing under the force of the water. "Faster!" he yelled, but she could hardly hear him. The roar drowned everything. The sky, the earth, her heartbeat. When they reached the porch, the first wave hit the lower posts, slamming into the steps. The whole house shivered. "Inside," he said, pushing her through the door. They stumbled into the kitchen, dripping, gasping. He barred the door with the iron rod from the stove. "That won't hold long if the water rises higher." "I can't just sit here," she said. "If the barn collapses." "Clara," he said, catching her shoulders. His eyes were fierce, but his voice was steady. "You can't save everything. Sometimes mercy means surviving." She met his gaze. "Then you go if you must. I won't leave it to drown." He stared at her for a long, exasperated heartbeat. Then, muttering a curse too soft for her to hear, he grabbed the lantern from the wall. "If you're going, then I'm going with you." The door opened on darkness thick as tar. They waded toward the barn, the lantern barely piercing the rain. The flood had climbed past their knees now, carrying debris that bumped against them like unseen hands. Each step forward felt like a gamble. The barn roof loomed ahead, its shadow trembling. As they neared, another crack echoed. The far wall of the barn split open, and a torrent rushed through, sweeping hay bales into the current. Clara screamed as one beam snapped loose, crashing into the water between them. She stumbled, and for one terrifying second, the flood dragged her down. The lantern flew from Thomas's hand and vanished. The world became water and thunder. Then his hand found hers, hard and sure, yanking her upward. She gasped, choking, clutching his arm. "I've got you," he shouted. "Don't let go." They fought their way to the barn wall and clung to it, the current pressing hard against their legs. The water rose to her waist. In the flicker of lightning, she saw fear in his eyes. Not for himself, but for her. A heavy crack tore through the air. Above them, the roof beam sagged, then fell, striking her shoulder and pinning her against the wall. Pain flared bright, white-hot. She cried out, trying to push it off, but it was too heavy. "Thomas!" He turned, saw her trapped, and waded back through the churning water. "Hold on!" The beam refused to move. He braced his body against it, teeth gritted, muscles straining. The flood surged higher, past their chests now, dragging at them both. "You have to go!" she shouted. "You'll drown!" "Not without you." With one last heave, he shifted the beam just enough. She slipped free, and they both stumbled back as the roof groaned again. "Go!" he roared, and they plunged toward the open door, the barn collapsing behind them with a roar that shook the ground. They ran, or tried to. The current fought every step, cold and merciless. When they reached the hill's slope, the water began to thin, but the mud sucked at their boots. Lightning flashed again, revealing the town below. Streets turned to rivers, lanterns bobbing, people shouting from rooftops. The church steeple stood like a ghost above the flood, its bell tolling wildly in the wind. Thomas turned, lifting her arm over his shoulder, helping her climb. "Almost there," he said. His voice was hoarse, nearly gone. They reached the ridge just as another surge hit the valley, the sound deafening. They collapsed beside a fallen tree, breathing hard. The rain poured down without mercy, turning the earth around them to liquid. Below, the widow's table was gone. The square where laughter had returned was a dark, swirling lake. The chapel steps were buried beneath water. Clara pressed her hands to her mouth. "Everything we built, gone." Thomas turned to her, his face streaked with mud and rain. "Not gone, just waiting, like kindness. It doesn't die. It hides until we need it again." His words struck something deep within her, the same chord Eli's letter had once touched. She looked at him, truly looked, and saw not just the blacksmith, but the man who had walked into her life like a spark refusing to die out. He was shivering, exhausted, yet he had not left her side even when death pressed close. Thunder rolled again. He pulled off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. "We'll head to the church," he said. "Higher ground there. The others will gather." They stumbled together through the rain, guided by the faint glow of lanterns in the distance. When they reached the chapel, the door was open, and inside, dozens of townsfolk huddled with blankets and candles. Children slept on pews. Mrs. Alders was there, holding her husband's hand. Sheriff Alden moved among them, soaked but steady, organizing, calming. When he saw Clara and Thomas enter, his eyes widened. "You made it," he said. "Thank God." She looked around at the faces, tired but alive, people she had once fed and who now waited for her with relief. The sheriff gestured to the supplies in the corner. "We saved what food we could. Not much, but enough to share." She smiled weakly. "Then the widow's table still stands." That night, as the storm raged outside, Clara ladled soup for those gathered, just as she always had, only now the table was made of faith and not wood. The people ate quietly, offering what little they had. Half a loaf, a handful of beans. Even Alden took a bowl, bowing his head before tasting it. When the wind finally eased, the church felt like the center of the world. Families leaned against one another, sharing warmth. A child laughed softly in her sleep. Clara sat near the altar, Thomas beside her, both too tired to speak. After a long silence, he took her hand. His thumb brushed over her knuckles, rough and gentle at once. "You risked everything for a few hens," he murmured, half smiling. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "No, I risked everything for a promise." Outside, the river still roared, but inside the chapel, peace gathered like a fragile flame refusing to die. The town had been broken, beaten, but not destroyed. In the dark, surrounded by those she had once fed, Clara realized the truth of it. Kindness was stronger than any flood. And though the storm had taken her home, it had given her something greater, a reason to keep living, and a hand to hold through every storm yet to come. Morning came like a shy guest, uncertain if it was welcome. The rain had stopped at last, leaving Willow Creek half drowned and quiet as a graveyard. Mist drifted above the flooded streets, turning everything silver and unreal. The church bell hung still, and what had once been the widow's table was only a reflection rippling in the muddy water. But there was life, faint, stubborn life, in the smell of smoke rising from the chapel's chimney and the soft hum of voices inside. Clara Merrin opened her eyes to that sound. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. The pew beneath her had become her bed, her shawl, her blanket. Her shoulder ached fiercely where the beam had struck her. When she tried to sit up, a hand steadied her. "Easy," said Thomas, his voice low. "You're safe now." She turned toward him. His face looked older in the pale light, streaked with exhaustion and soot, but his eyes, those same dark, honest eyes, held the calm of someone who had made peace with chaos. "How long?" she asked. 2 days. You've been drifting in and out." 2 days, she murmured. "The others? They're alive. Most of them anyway. The lower stables are gone. But the town stood better than we feared. She let out a long breath. The hens? He smiled faintly, still clucking in the church shed. Tougher than most people I know. That earned a soft laugh from her. Short and shaky, but real. It felt strange to laugh when the world outside was ruined. Stranger still that hope could survive where homes had not. The door creaked open, and Sheriff Alden Cross stepped in, his coat hanging heavy with damp. He removed his hat respectfully when he saw Clara awake. "Mrs. Merrin," he said quietly, "I'm glad to see you breathing. The town owes you more than it can ever pay." "I didn't do anything others wouldn't have done," she said, though they all knew that wasn't true. He walked closer, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. "You fed them when they cursed you. You stayed when they turned away. And when the water came, you fought harder than most men." She tried to look away, but he reached into his coat pocket. "There's something I found," he said. From the folds of his jacket, he drew a small bundle wrapped in cloth, the fabric stained with mud. "The jeweler's wagon was swept clear out past the ridge. We recovered what we could. This was in his box." He placed it in her trembling hands. She untied the string. Inside lay her wedding ring, dulled by dirt but whole. The engraving still faintly caught the light, always in kindness. Her breath hitched. "You bought it back?" Alden nodded. Figured it belonged where it started. For a long time she couldn't speak. The ring felt warm, as if it had been waiting for her. "Eli once said kindness outlasts death," she whispered. "I suppose he was right." The sheriff's gaze softened, his voice breaking slightly. "I wronged you both. I carried that guilt longer than I care to admit. If forgiveness has room in your heart—" She looked up at him, her eyes steady. "Forgiveness isn't something I give. It's something we build, piece by piece. You've already laid the first stone." He bowed his head, unable to answer. When he turned to leave, she caught his sleeve. "Sheriff," she said, "you've done enough harm trying to lead through pride. Try leading through mercy now." He met her eyes and nodded once. "I will." After he left, the church fell quiet, except for the faint crackle of the stove. Thomas knelt by it, feeding another stick of wood into the fire. "I don't know if I'll ever get used to seeing that man humble," he said. "Maybe he was waiting for someone to show him how," she replied. The light from the flames flickered across his face. For the first time since she had met him, she noticed how the lines at his mouth curved more from restraint than from age, how his eyes softened when they rested on her. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was full of things neither dared to name. When she slipped the ring back on her finger, Thomas's gaze followed the motion. "That belonged to Eli," he said carefully. "It still does," she said. "But it also belongs to the promise it carried." And that promise didn't die with him. He smiled, the kind of smile that comes from pain shared and understood. He was a lucky man. "So am I," she said softly, surprising herself with the truth of it. Outside, the storm had left behind a wounded world. The river had changed its course, cutting deep scars through the land. The road leading out of town was gone, replaced by mud and broken fences. But the people of Willow Creek moved through the wreckage with purpose. They cleared debris, rebuilt walls, and carried buckets of water to what little remained of their homes. For once, no one worked alone. Clara watched them from the church steps, her arms still bound in a sling. Children ran barefoot through puddles, laughing despite the ruin. The widow's table was gone, but the spirit of it lived in the way they shared bread and tools, in the way strangers called each other neighbor again. Thomas came up beside her, sleeves rolled, hair dripping with sweat. "We're rebuilding your house next," he said. The men already started clearing the hill. "My house?" she asked, surprised. "It's part of the town, isn't it? You built something worth keeping. They know that now." She looked at him, her eyes wet. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," he said, smiling. "Thank yourself. You're the one who taught us to stand together." They walked down toward the square, where a dozen townsfolk had gathered to share what food they'd salvaged. The tables were mismatched, old doors, planks, barrels, but the sight of them made her chest ache with memory. Someone had placed a single lantern in the center, its flame steady against the breeze. When they saw Clara approach, the chatter quieted. People stepped aside to make room for her. Mrs. Haskett, once the loudest of her critics, pressed a loaf into Clara's hands. "For you," she said, voice trembling. "It's not much, but it's yours." Clara smiled through tears. "Then I'll share it." She tore the loaf in half, handed one piece to a child nearby, then another to Mrs. Alders. The circle formed again, familiar and full. Laughter rose, timid at first, then louder. It sounded like forgiveness. By evening, the first stars appeared, pale and uncertain above the lingering mist. Thomas walked her home, or what was left of it. The frame of the house still stood, though the roof was gone. They stood in the doorway, the smell of wet wood thick in the air. "Doesn't look like much," he said. "It looks like a beginning," she answered. He set down the lantern and began clearing debris, lifting broken boards, straightening a beam. She joined him, her movements slow but determined. The work was quiet, but every sound, the scrape of wood, the sigh of the lantern flame, felt like prayer. When they paused to rest, he looked out over the valley. "I used to think this town was cursed," he said. "Now I think it was just hungry for the right kind of love." "Love doesn't always come easy," she said. "Sometimes it takes a flood to wash away what's rotten." He nodded. "Maybe that's what this was, a reckoning. Or a baptism." He turned toward her then, eyes catching the lantern's glow. "Clara," he said, her name rough on his tongue. "You've spent so long giving everything away. Don't you ever want something back?" She met his gaze, feeling her pulse quicken. "What could I take that hasn't already been given?" He stepped closer. "You could take me," he said quietly, "if you'd have me." For a heartbeat, the world stilled. The rain had stopped. The crickets had begun their cautious songs. In the quiet, her heart made its choice before her mind could protest. She reached out, her fingers brushing his. "Then stay." He did. The months that followed were slow but sweet. The town rebuilt itself, beam by beam, garden by garden. Each morning, smoke rose from the chimneys again. Children's laughter replaced the silence, and every Sunday the people of Willow Creek gathered in the square for a meal, not out of hunger but out of memory. They called it the Widow's Feast. Clara and Thomas cooked side by side, their hands finding each other easily now. The sheriff came too, gray at the temples but lighter in spirit. He would always bring flowers for the table, a simple gesture, but one that meant everything. On the first spring after the flood, Clara stood in her rebuilt home, the windows open to warm air. The hills beyond were green again. She wore Eli's ring still, not as a relic, but as a reminder. Thomas came in from the porch, carrying a basket of apples. "They're saying the harvest will be good this year," he said. "The river left rich soil behind." She smiled, taking one from the basket. "Maybe kindness does outlast death after all." He brushed his hand against hers. "It does when you're the one carrying it." Outside, the church bell rang, a single clear note that rolled across the valley. She leaned into him, her voice barely above a whisper. "It sounds different now." He nodded. "It sounds like home." They stepped outside together, the evening sun laying gold across the town. People waved from doorways. Children ran between puddles that glimmered like small mirrors. The widow's table stood again in the square, rebuilt from salvaged wood, its surface polished and waiting for tomorrow's bread. Clara reached for Thomas's hand, her fingers twining with his, the ring catching the last of the light. It gleamed, faint but steady, scarred but unbroken. And as they walked toward the laughter rising from below, she knew this truth in her bones: love, like kindness, does not die. It survives every storm, every loss, every flood. It waits, patient and stubborn, until the heart learns to open its door again. In Willow Creek, they would tell her story for generations, the widow who sold her wedding ring to feed the strangers who hated her and who found, in giving everything, the one thing she thought she had lost forever. In the quiet heart of Willow Creek, a widow's simple act of kindness became the spark that rebuilt a broken town. Clara Merrin proved that love isn't measured by what we keep, but by what we're brave enough to give away. Through storm and sorrow, she showed that even when the world forgets you, kindness remembers, and it always finds its way home. If this story of love, loss, and redemption touched your heart, saddle up and subscribe to Wild West Love Chronicles. Don't miss the next ride into the untamed frontier, where every tale holds a heartbeat, every storm hides a love story, and every ending leaves a mark on the soul.